A man's back bent over something on the floor. His rear end and the soles of his work boots turned toward her, and then his back reared up, and he turned into the flashlight's beam, and she saw James Harris. But there was something wrong with the lower half of his face, something black, shiny, and chitinous, like a cockroach's leg, stuck several inches out of his mouth. His jaws hung open, stupefied, as he blinked blearily in the light, but otherwise his body didn't move as this long insectoid appendage slowly withdrew into his mouth. And when it had retreated fully, he closed his lips, and she saw that his chin and cheeks and the tip of his nose were coated in slick, wet blood. And that is an excerpt from the book I'll be reviewing today, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Can you trust your neighbor? Is your community knit by the firm fabric of trust and genuine communication, or is that fabric degenerating and the community unraveling? These questions resonated in my mind as I read Grady Hendrix's vampire novel. It's the story of Patricia Campbell, a woman who's overwhelmed by the hectic life of raising 2 kids and a husband who's gobbled up by his career much of the time. She finds solace in her book club, discussing true crime books with neighborhood friends, as well as enjoying conversation about each other's family life. One night following a book club session, Patricia is brutally attacked by an elderly neighbor, losing an earlobe in the encounter. Through this bizarre and frightening experience, she meets her neighbor's nephew, James Harris, an intelligent, worldly, handsome man who fulfills her in ways she hasn't experienced before. But matters begin to take a turn for the worst. Children go missing. Children are dying. And Patricia stumbles upon proof that James Harris is involved. Now she must face the challenge of convincing those in her community that a monster is in their midst. A monster with the frightening ability to manipulate those closest to her. So what is there to like about this novel? Well, quite a bit, really. I think the novel's greatest strength are its characters. They are vividly drawn and carefully textured. They stand out from one another. Their demeanor, speech, and physical appearance makes them feel like real people. Here's an excerpt from the book that exhibits a significant detail for each character, allowing each to uniquely shine. Patricia looked around to see what the other women thought. Mary Ellen in her dry clean blue jeans and her hair scrunchy and her harsh Yankee voice. Tiny Slick looking like a particularly eager mouse with her pointy teeth and beady eyes. Kitty in her denim blouse with musical notes splayed across the front in gold sequins, slurping down a mug of wine, hair a mess, like a bear just woken up from hibernation. And finally Grace with a ruffled bow at her throat, sitting straight, hands folded perfectly in her lap, eyes blinking slowly from behind her large frame glasses, studying them like an owl. These women were too different from her. Patricia didn't belong here. I love how you can imagine each of these characters' unique personalities through the vivid descriptions Hendrix provides, and you can also easily identify with Patricia's insecurity being an outsider of the group as she's trying to figure out a way to filter herself into it. The novel also does a great job at depicting the whirlwind, hectic family and community life that Patricia is experiencing. You start to feel delirious as maybe she feels, and you feel on the verge of panting and being out of breath as maybe she would feel. The novel does a good job at balancing the elements of humor and horror throughout the story. This novel is a very clever novel, has a lot of wit and humor. And sometimes when a horror novel fails to balance that humor with the horror, it can push either into an absurd territory that leaves you with a bad taste, or the novel exhibits no humor at all, and you can sometimes drown in a funk. Overall, I think Hendrix's novel balances this pretty well. Towards the climax, there's an intense dismemberment scene, just a gory, bloody thing. And it tries to use dashes of humor in which James Harris, the vampire character, is being dismembered. He mocks the women that are doing it. He pleads with them. And it doesn't quite cross the line into the absurd territory that leaves you with a bad taste, but it kind of straddles the line. That might be one small downside to the book. However, I must admit I'm being a bit nitpicky, though. I think overall the novel balances these elements well. And this contrast is useful because contrasting the horror with the humor does make the horror scenes hit with a greater impact. I'm also a big fan of how the vampire is depicted in the novel. There were things that served as a homage to other vampire stories. However, James Harris, the vampire, I think stands out on his own, too. I liked the creepy insectoid element to his character. He's like a giant mosquito, and how he uses a chitinous extension from his throat to suck blood. I was fascinated in how the circulation of the victim's blood into his bloodstream served as a purification process, kind of like dialysis. So the novel takes place from the early to mid to late 1990s, and I think Grady recreates this time period in a very realistic and fresh way. Paul Tremblay, he's the author of A Head Full of Ghosts. He says, quote, "The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is funny and warm, and it's genuinely creepy and disturbing. Grady recreates a time and place without the dangerous, distortive lens of nostalgia." End quote. And I fully agree. I feel Grady recreates this time in a seamless way that doesn't call a lot of attention to itself. You know, it's not distracting anyway. You're able to slip into that time period with the characters without it being distracting. Neither does the novel exaggerate that time period into being something it wasn't, as we're wont to do when we recollect something through the distortive lens of nostalgia. So my final verdict is, I think this is a great book. It's clever, it's witty, there's a lot of humor. It's horrifying, though, at the same time. There's scenes that made me shudder and totally creep me out. It's a smart horror story. It doesn't just hit you in the jugular, it makes you think as well, and the characters are alive on the page. So I tell you what, man, sink your teeth into this book, and I guarantee you will not be able to stop yourself from devouring it to the end. So this completes my review of Grady Hendrix's novel, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Please comment below, guys. Let me know what you think of the novel. Let me know if you're planning to read it. Please like this video, share it with your friends. All these things help keep the monster of DeathGroundReviews alive. A monster that devours horror, suspense, and all those things of the fantastic. I'll see you guys next time.